Okay, so one of the things that these particular ratios tell us is that how does a low-wage country compete? So if you thought about international trade, say, between the United States and China, one of the things that we know is that manufacturing wages in the United States are, on average, about 20 times higher than average manufacturing wages in China. Right? So you might think, how is it possible, since labor costs are always a very significant portion of total production costs, how is it possible for the United States to export any manufactured goods at all to China? We do, by the way, export a large number of manufactured goods to China. But we've got really, really high wages. So the way that it's possible is that if you have high wages, you also have to have really high productivity. So if your unit labor requirements are really low, it can offset the really high wage. One of the reasons Chinese manufacturing workers are paid so little relative to American manufacturing workers is that, and the way that they compete, of course, is on those low wages. You read about that all the time. But the reason that they have those really low wages is their average level of productivity is really low. So a low-wage country competes, they have to have low wages because their productivities are low. High-wage countries can only compete internationally if their productivities are high. It's the only way it'll work. Otherwise, you're going to end up with comparative disadvantages, and you'll see your industry shrink. Okay, we've settled this. Okay, we've settled this. Okay, so oftentimes it's argued, wages and productivity don't go together. But in fact, what this particular diagram shows is that on a vertical axis, we've got hourly wage as a percentage of the U.S. This is in manufacturing. And on the horizontal axis, productivity levels as a percentage of the U.S. I know this is out of your text, so it's a little bit dated. But what you can see, the U.S., of course, has to be at the 100 mark. And what we would expect if wages and productivity followed each other is a very strong positive relationship between those two. You can see they just plotted a few countries in there, and you can see exactly where everybody lines up. Low-wage countries generally have very low productivity. High-wage countries always have high levels of productivity, or they don't engage in international trade. Okay, so let's just summarize real quick what this classic Ricardian model shows us. One is, trade occurs because we have differences in labor productivity. That's the real key here. Our production technology is different because our workers are more productive versus other workers in other countries. Notice at this stage, we haven't said anything about why workers are more productive in one country versus another. We'll talk about that in the future, but right now we're only concentrating on that labor productivity. The second is, trade is advantageous for everybody in both countries. In this classic model where both countries specialize, all the workers will be in those specialized industries, their salaries will go up. Now, nobody pointed out that, yes, the salaries went up in Portugal, so did the price of cloth. In fact, the price of cloth went up exactly the same amount as the wages did. So the real purchasing power for the workers in the cloth industry has actually stayed the same. The real purchasing power in buying cloth has stayed the same. But wine prices have come down. So we've got higher wages with lower wine prices, and that's what makes workers better off. We've got an expanded consumption possibilities. The same thing is true of England. We saw that a technologically inferior country, England in our example, can still benefit from trade by specializing in the production and then the export of those goods in which it has a comparative advantage. And our high-wage country, Portugal, remember $10 versus $3.33, can still compete against a foreign country with low wages, but only if its productivity is sufficiently high. Bless you. Okay, so the model that we've just talked about is actually the model that David Ricardo put forward almost 200 years ago. As I said last time, he used England and Portugal. He used wine and cloth. He actually used wine being the comparative advantage of Portugal and cloth being the comparative advantage of England, just the opposite of what we've done, because I didn't want you to have any preconceived notions about who has a comparative advantage. Of course, they don't make good wine in England. And of course, they do make good wine in Portugal. So remember, 200 years ago, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, England was a manufacturing powerhouse compared to most of the rest of the world. So that's why England actually had a comparative advantage in cloth. But Portugal actually has very sunny slopes. Actually, it's not widely known, but many of the oldest Portuguese wineries are actually owned by the English, for reasons I'll tell you maybe later. Okay, but anyway, let's. One of the things that we recognize is that there's some very, very restrictive assumptions in terms of this classic Ricardian model. They may have been fine for 200 years ago. They're not necessarily fine today. So we can relax a couple of those assumptions. And the first assumption that we want to relax was our assumption number, whatever it was. Remember, we had assumed that we had constant labor productivity. We don't need to make that assumption. So we'll make a standard assumption that we have diminishing returns or diminishing marginal product of labor in both industries in both countries. So we're just making that one little change. So if that happens, then the marginal product of labor will decline as employment increases, and the production functions will look something like this. Now the key is, the only thing that's different is I've added an exponent to the labor component, the labor variable. And each one of these exponents was 1 in the classic Ricardian model. Now they're less than 1. They're all less than 1. And that's what will give us diminishing returns. What our production functions would actually look like then would be something like this. Production function for cloth, production function for wine in Portugal. Okay? So notice, rather than being straight lines, they kind of bend down. Since the marginal product of labor is the slope of the production function, as that production function bends down, the slope of the tangency at various points along the line will also diminish. I'm not going to draw in England. You can fill that in if you want. But let's see what that means for the production possibilities frontier. So remember, down here, we've got the production possibilities frontier for cloth. And up here, in the upper left, we've got the production possibilities frontier for wine. I'm sorry, production function. We still have our labor constraint. Yeah, that doesn't look right. And now we can figure out what our production possibilities frontier looks like using the same exercise that we did before. Put all your workers in the wine industry, see what you've got. Put all your workers in the cloth industry, see what your maximum production is. But at this point, now you need some sort of an intermediate point, because when you have bow-shaped production functions, you're also going to end up with a bow-shaped production possibilities frontier. Whoop, probably not quite that fall off-ish. So notice then that our production possibilities frontier is now sloping rather than a straight line, which means, of course, that the opportunity cost of producing cloth will change as we move along the production possibilities frontier itself. The shape of this production possibilities frontier is determined by the shape of the production functions in the two industries. No different than what we had done earlier. So again, we don't need to do that. So this is Portugal's production possibilities frontier. Notice it's still biased towards cloth production, which would still tell us that Portugal has a comparative advantage in cloth. The opportunity cost of producing cloth will be the slope of the tangency, which is actually equal to the marginal product of labor in wine minus the marginal product of labor in cloth. And again, notice that that's going to change as you move along the production possibilities frontier. So the opportunity cost is very low when you're producing very little cloth. It's very high when you're producing a lot of cloth. Okay, and here's England's production possibilities frontier. Again, we've drawn it so it continues to have a bias towards wine, just as we had before. So notice we really haven't made very many changes here. Everything pretty much looks the same. We've taken a straight line production possibilities curve and recognized that with diminishing marginal product of labor, we're going to have bow-shaped production functions and therefore bow-shaped production possibilities frontiers. So here's the equilibrium autarky position. So notice we've got a production possibilities frontier. We have an ISO value line, and we have a budget constraint. Now we saw previously that in equilibrium, in order to produce some of both goods, that the opportunity cost of production has to equal the relative price of cloth, right? So that's why we can say that the slope here, we don't have to worry about what the marginal product of labor or the unit labor requirements are. We can say that this budget line, or ISO value line, has a slope that's equal to the relative price of cloth. So remember, for Portugal, that was equal to a half. Okay. And here's England's autarky situation, where the budget constraint has a slope of -2. Yes? Production possibilities frontier. Right. So we know what the slope is. All we're going to do is find the tangency on the production possibilities frontier. Notice at this particular point, the relative price equals the opportunity cost of production. So the marginal rate of transformation is equal to the marginal rate of substitution. So that's a general equilibrium position. Okay, now we need to think about what happens to our world relative supply and demand curves. In particular, what we want to think about is what our relative supply curves look like. Because we already know what our relative demand curves look like, right? Our relative demand curve for the two countries will be the same. But when we have diminishing marginal product of labor, we now have increasing costs of production. As we add more and more workers, the incremental output that we get diminishes, which means to get equal increments of output, we need more and more workers, which of course means higher and higher costs. So rather than having horizontal aggregate supply curves, relative supply curves, we actually have upward sloping relative supply curves. Now, one of these relative supply curves is for Portugal, the other one is for England. So which one is for Portugal, the one on the right or the one on the left? Okay, let's have a show of hands. For how many Portugal's relative supply curve is on the right? On the left? Just like an election. Only 32% participation. Okay, so Portugal is on the right. The easy way to see that is we already know in autarky, Portugal's relative price is much lower than England's. And as we saw before, this also suggests that in Portugal, we will be consuming and producing a higher relative quantity of cloth than we will in England. Now, we open it up to international trade. What happens? Well, same price pressures are going to occur. Portuguese cloth makers are going to want to sell cloth in England, raising the price of cloth in Portugal and lowering the price of cloth in England. English winemakers will want to sell some of their output in Portugal, so wine prices will fall in Portugal and rise in England. So the relative price will fall till we get to some level of world price. And I didn't draw that quite right because there's one other thing that we can see here. So this is the relative quantity of, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted to say. Never mind. Okay, so we've got a convergence of relative prices just as we had seen before. So this is our autarky situation. What happens next is, of course, that the budget line will now rotate higher. And that will put us on a higher country indifference curve. So the level of aggregate economic welfare has been improved. The demand for cloth will fall. The supply of cloth will increase. And we will export the difference. In the wine industry, the supply of wine decreases, but does not go to zero. Bless you. And the demand for wine increases, and the difference, of course, is what we import. So we have a new general equilibrium at point B. But a couple of things to notice. In this more general form of the Ricardian model, countries do not completely specialize. Both countries are still producing both goods. The price of the good that we're exporting rises, the good in which we have a comparative advantage, and the good that we're importing, the price of the good of which we're importing is falling. Normally, that means that wages, we won't work through the wage component, but normally wages will rise in industries that are exporting and fall in industries, domestic industries, in which we are importing, something that we'll see next week. Okay, so you've got the Ricardian model under your belts now, so we've got one model to help explain the pattern of international trade, and it shows that labor productivity is the key factor. The countries that have a comparative advantage in the production of a good will end up exporting that good and then import those goods in which it has a comparative disadvantage. Okay, have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.